They called it unauthorized expenditures. She called it love. For 40 years, Margaret Hayes emptied her savings account for children who had nothing. $187,000. Gone. Every single penny. And now 5 people in designer suits wanted to destroy her for it. Her job, her pension, her dignity. She stood alone at that podium. 62 years old. Not a single soul came to defend her. But what walked through those doors next? It brought the entire school board to their knees. You know what breaks my heart about this? Nobody showed up. 40 years of love, and the seats were empty. And I think deep down, we all know that feeling. That feeling when you realize you've been fighting alone. What is your opinion? Replay me in comment section. Let's start the video. The boardroom was cold. Not the kind of cold that comes from air conditioning or winter drafts. No. This was a different kind of cold. The kind that seeps into your bones when you realize that the people sitting in front of you have already decided your fate. The kind that wraps around your heart when you understand that 40 years of sacrifice means nothing to people who have never sacrificed anything at all. Margaret Hayes felt that cold as she stood alone at the podium. Her hands trembled slightly against the wooden surface, not from fear. Margaret Hayes had never been afraid of anything in her 62 years of life. She trembled from exhaustion, from decades of fighting battles that no one else was willing to fight, from carrying weights that no one else was willing to carry. And now, after everything she had given, she stood in this sterile room, facing 5 white faces in expensive suits who stared at her like she was nothing more than a problem to be solved. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glow across the long mahogany table where the school board members sat. Their chairs were leather, their suits were tailored, their expressions were carefully neutral, but Margaret could see the judgment in their eyes. She had been a teacher long enough to read faces. She knew when someone had already made up their mind, and these 5 people with their gold watches and their polished shoes had made up their minds before she ever walked through the door. The superintendent, Harold Brennan, sat at the center of the table. He was a tall man with silver hair and glasses that he liked to slide down his nose when he wanted to appear thoughtful. He did that now, adjusting his spectacles as he opened a thick manila folder in front of him. The sound of papers shuffling echoed through the silent room. Margaret glanced behind her. The seats in the gallery were empty. Not a single person had come to speak on her behalf. Not one parent, not one colleague, not one friend, just rows and rows of empty chairs, like a graveyard of support that never existed. She had called the teachers' union. They said they would look into it. She had reached out to community leaders. They said they were busy. She had even tried to contact some of the parents whose children she had helped over the years. No one answered. So Margaret stood alone, just like she had always stood, just like she had always fought. The only difference was that this time she wasn't sure she had any fight left. Harold Brennan cleared his throat. The sound was deliberate, theatrical. He wanted her to feel small. He wanted her to feel afraid. Margaret lifted her chin and looked him directly in the eyes. She refused to give him the satisfaction. "Mrs. Hayes," he began, his voice smooth like oil on water, "we're here today to discuss your unauthorized expenditures." He said the words slowly, letting each syllable hang in the air like an accusation. Unauthorized expenditures. As if she had stolen something. As if she had committed a crime. Margaret's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. She knew how this game was played. Speak too soon, and they would use your words against you. Wait too long, and they would claim you had nothing to say. So she waited. She watched. She let the silence build. The superintendent continued, flipping through the pages in his folder with exaggerated care. "According to our records, over the past several years, you have spent approximately $187,000 of your personal funds on students at Lincoln Heights Elementary." He looked up at her, eyebrows raised, as if expecting her to deny it. She didn't. Why would she? Every dollar she had spent was a dollar well used. Every cent had gone to children who needed it. New textbooks when the school refused to provide them. Winter coats when children came to class shivering in thin jackets. School supplies when families couldn't afford pencils. Lunch money when students went hungry. College application fees when bright young minds couldn't afford $50 to chase their dreams. $187,000. Her entire life savings, gone. And she would do it again in a heartbeat. "You understand," Harold continued, his voice dripping with false concern, "that this sets a dangerous precedent. A dangerous precedent." The words hit Margaret like a slap across the face. A dangerous precedent. Loving children too much, caring too deeply, Giving too freely. That was her crime. That was her unforgivable sin. She had dared to do what the school board refused to do. She had dared to invest in children that the system had abandoned. And for that, they wanted to destroy her. One of the board members, a woman with blonde hair and diamond earrings that probably cost more than Margaret's entire wardrobe, leaned forward. Her name was Patricia Whitmore, and she was known for her charity galas and her donations to the local symphony. She had never once visited Lincoln Heights Elementary. "Mrs. Hayes," Patricia said, her voice sickeningly sweet, "we appreciate your enthusiasm, but surely you understand that what you've done could be seen as inappropriate. Some might even say manipulative. Manipulative." The word burned in Margaret's chest. She had spent 4 decades giving everything she had to children who had nothing. She had skipped meals so her students LD eat. She had worn the same clothes for years so she could buy them new shoes. She had watched her marriage crumble because her husband couldn't understand why she loved those kids more than she loved their comfortable future. And now this woman, with her diamonds and her designer clothes, was calling her manipulative. Margaret wanted to scream. She wanted to slam her fists on the podium and demand to know what any of them had ever sacrificed. But she didn't. She had learned long ago that anger was a luxury she couldn't afford. Black women who got angry were labeled, dismissed, destroyed. So she swallowed her rage and let it settle in her stomach like a stone. Harold Brennan closed his folder and folded his hands on the table. "Mrs. Hayes, the board has serious concerns about your conduct. Your actions, while perhaps well-intentioned, have created complications. Parents are asking why the school isn't providing these resources. Teachers are questioning why they should follow rules that you apparently ignore. And frankly, your behavior makes this district look inadequate." There it was, the truth behind everything. They weren't angry that she had helped children. They were angry that her generosity exposed their neglect. They were ashamed that a single teacher with a modest salary had done more for those students than their entire budget. She was a mirror, and they didn't like what they saw, so they wanted to shatter her. Margaret's husband had left 3 years ago. Ad handed her divorce papers on a Tuesday evening, right after she came home from buying winter boots for a student named Keisha, whose mother worked 3 jobs and still couldn't make ends meet. "You love those kids more than you love us," he had said. "More than you love our future. I can't compete with that anymore." She had signed the papers without a word. Because he was right. She did love those kids. They needed her in ways he never would. Now, standing in this cold boardroom, Margaret felt the weight of every choice she had made. Her retirement account was empty, her savings were gone, her husband was gone, and if this board had their way, her career would be gone too. They wanted her badge, her pension, her dignity. They wanted to erase 40 years of sacrifice as if it had never happened. She looked at the 5 faces before her, 5 people who had never stepped foot in her classroom. 5 people who had never held a crying child who hadn't eaten in 2 days. 5 people who had never watched a student's eyes light up when they finally understood a math problem. They knew nothing about what she had built, nothing about the lives she had changed. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, to explain why every dollar spent was worth more than anything they could measure in their spreadsheets. But before she could say a word, the heavy wooden doors behind her suddenly swung open. The sound echoed through the silent room like thunder. Every head turned, and in that moment, everything changed. To understand what happened in that boardroom, you need to understand where Margaret Hayes came from. You need to understand the school where she spent 40 years of her life. You need to understand the children she loved and the sacrifices she made when no one was watching. Lincoln Heights Elementary sat on the corner of Martin Luther King Boulevard and Hope Street. The irony of that address was not lost on anyone who actually lived in the neighborhood. Hope Street had very little hope. The buildings were crumbling, the sidewalks were cracked, and the school itself looked like it had been forgotten by time and abandoned by the people who were supposed to care. The hallways smelled of mold and despair. The ceiling tiles were stained from years of leaks that no one ever fixed. The library had 17 books. 17. Margaret had counted them herself on her first day 40 years ago, and she had wept in her car during her lunch break. The heating system broke every winter without fail, and every winter, the district promised to fix it. They never did. But room 214 was different. Room 214 was Margaret's kingdom, and she ruled it with love and determination. She had painted the walls herself on weekends, bright colors that made children smile when they walked through the door. She had filled the shelves with books she bought from garage sales and thrift stores. She had covered the bulletin boards with student artwork and motivational quotes. Room 214 was a sanctuary in a building that felt more like a prison. And the children knew it. They knew that when they stepped into Mrs. Hayes' classroom, they were safe. They were valued. They were seen. Margaret remembered every single one of them. She remembered Deshaun Williams, a quiet boy with thick glasses held together by tape and prayer. He was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. His mind worked like a computer, processing information faster than Margaret could teach it. But his family couldn't afford new glasses, and the ones he wore were so scratched he could barely see the board. Margaret had noticed him squinting one day, his nose nearly touching his paper as he tried to read. She asked him about his glasses after class. He had shrugged and looked at the floor, embarrassed. "They're fine, Mrs. Hayes," he had mumbled. But they weren't fine. Nothing about his situation was fine. That weekend, Margaret took Deshaun to the optometrist. She paid for the exam. She paid for the new glasses de Burberk. She watched his face transform when he put them on and saw the world clearly for the first time in years. "Mrs. Hayes," he had whispered, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I can see the leaves on the trees. I didn't know they had so many lines." Margaret had hugged him tight and promised herself she would never let another child suffer when she had the power to help. Then there was Aisha Montgomery. Sweet, stubborn Aisha with her braids and her attitude and her heart of pure gold. Aisha was in 5th grade when doctors discovered she needed surgery. Her mother worked as a housekeeper at a motel on the highway. Her father was gone. There was no insurance, no savings, no hope. Margaret organized 3 bake sales. She sold cookies and brownies and cakes until her kitchen was covered in flour and her hands ached from mixing. She raised $2,000. The surgery cost $8,000. So Margaret wrote a check for the difference without telling anyone. She didn't want credit. She didn't want praise. She just wanted Aisha to live. And Aisha did. She recovered beautifully, and she never knew where that money came from until years later. And then there was Marcus Thompson. Marcus was a senior in high school when he got accepted to Morehouse College, the first person in his family to ever be accepted to a 4-year university. The letter came on a Thursday, and Marcus burst into Margaret's classroom after school, waving the paper like a flag of victory. She had hugged him so tight she thought she might break him. But the celebration was short-lived. The enrollment deposit was $500. Marcus's grandmother, who had raised him since he was 3, didn't have it. She worked at the chicken processing plant and earned minimum wage. $500 might as well have been $5 million. Margaret saw the hope drain from Marcus's eyes as the deadline approached. She watched him start to accept that maybe Morehouse wasn't meant for him. Maybe dreams were only for people who could afford them. The night before the deadline, Margaret sat at her kitchen table and stared at her checkbook. Her savings account held exactly $547. She wrote the check for $500. She mailed it herself the next morning. Her husband found out a week later. He had been tracking their accounts, watching their retirement fund shrink year after year as Margaret gave more and more away. That night he confronted her in their living room. "Why do you do this?" he had demanded, his voice rising with frustration. "Why do you give everything to other people's children when we have nothing left for ourselves?" Margaret had looked at him calmly. "Because no one else will," she had said. He didn't understand. How could he? He had grown up comfortable, fed, clothed, visible. He had never known what it felt like to be invisible, to be forgotten, to be written off before you ever had a chance. But Margaret knew. She knew because she had lived it. Margaret grew up in the same neighborhood where she now taught. She remembered walking to school barefoot because her shoes had holes too big to ignore. She remembered going to bed hungry, her stomach growling so loud it kept her awake. She remembered being invisible, a poor black girl in a world that didn't see poor black girls as worthy of attention or investment. But one teacher had seen her, Mrs. Robinson, a woman with gray hair and gentle hands who taught 3rd grade at Lincoln Heights Elementary. One day, Mrs. Robinson had noticed Margaret's bare feet. She didn't say anything in front of the other children. She simply asked Margaret to stay after class. And then she handed her a box. Inside were a brand new pair of shoes, white sneakers with pink laces. the most beautiful things Margaret had ever seen. "Every child deserves to walk with dignity," Mrs. Robinson had said. Those shoes changed Margaret's life, not because they were expensive or special, but because someone had cared enough to notice. Someone had cared enough to act. Margaret decided that day that she would become a teacher, and she would spend her life being Mrs. Robinson for as many children as possible. But the district didn't see her sacrifice as noble. They saw it as threatening. Emails leaked to Margaret by a sympathetic secretary revealed the truth. "She's making us look bad," one board member had written. "If one teacher can fund these kids from her own pocket, what does that say about our budget allocations? We need to shut this down before it becomes a bigger problem." So they built a case against her. They gathered documents. They interviewed colleagues who were jealous of her reputation. They framed her generosity as misconduct, misuse of influence, emotional manipulation, unprofessional conduct. They used cold bureaucratic language to describe something beautiful, and they prepared to fire her. As Margaret stood before the board that day, she realized the truth with painful clarity. They weren't angry that she had spent her savings on children. They were ashamed that they had never spent a dime. And shame, when it festers in powerful people, turns into cruelty. The doors swung open with a force that shook the room. The sound echoed off the walls like a thunderclap, and every head in the boardroom turned toward the entrance. Margaret spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what she expected to see. Perhaps security coming to escort her out. Perhaps another board member arriving late to witness her humiliation. But what she saw instead stole the breath from her lungs and made her knees weak. One by one they entered, slowly at first, then faster. A flood of people pouring through the doors like a river breaking through a dam. 30 people, 40 people, 50 people, they kept coming. Black men in tailored suits with polished shoes. Black women in doctors' coats with stethoscopes around their necks. Teachers carrying certificates. Engineers with company badges. Lawyers in crisp professional attire. They filled the seats that had been empty just moments before. They stood along the walls when the seats ran out. They crowded the doorway, still more trying to push inside. Margaret's vision blurred with tears. She recognized them, every single face. They were older now, changed, grown. But she knew them, she had taught them, she had loved them, she had given them everything she had. These were her students, her children. They had come back. Deshaun Williams stepped forward from the crowd. He was no longer the quiet boy with the taped glasses. He was a man now, tall, confident, powerful. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Margaret made in a month, and his glasses were designer frames that fit his face perfectly, but his eyes were the same, those kind, brilliant eyes that she remembered from 40 years ago. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice strong and steady. She covered her mouth with her hand, unable to speak. Deshaun was a neurosurgeon now. He operated on brains at Johns Hopkins Hospital, one of the most prestigious medical institutions in the country. He saved lives every day with hands that Margaret had once helped steady over math worksheets. Behind him, Aisha Montgomery emerged from the crowd. She wore a black robe over her professional clothes, and Margaret realized with a shock that it was a judge's robe. Aisha was a federal judge. The little girl who needed surgery, whose life had hung in the balance, was now one of the most powerful legal authorities in the state. She had tears streaming down her face as she looked at her old teacher. "Mrs. Hayes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We came as soon as we heard." And behind Aisha stood Marcus Thompson, the boy who almost didn't go to Morehouse because of $500. He was a CEO now, running a technology company worth millions. He wore success like a second skin, but when he looked at Margaret, he was still the scared 17-year-old who thought his dreams were impossible. The superintendent's face went pale. His carefully constructed power play was crumbling before his eyes. He looked at the crowd filling his boardroom, and for the first time he seemed uncertain. "What is this?" he stammered, his voice losing its smooth confidence. "This is a closed meeting. You can't just—" Deshaun stepped forward, cutting him off with a single raised hand. His voice was steel when he spoke. "This is what $187,000 looks like when you invest in people instead of budgets." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder, which he placed deliberately on the table in front of the superintendent. "Inside that folder," Deshaun continued, "you will find 847 documented success stories, doctors, lawyers, teachers, engineers, business owners, community leaders. Every single one of them was taught by Margaret Hayes. Every single one of them was helped by Margaret Hayes. Every single one of them is standing in a better place today because that woman refused to give up on them. Board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Patricia Burr Whitmore, with her diamonds and her judgment, couldn't meet anyone's eyes. She stared at the table like she wished it would swallow her whole. The superintendent opened the folder with trembling hands and began flipping through the pages. Photographs of graduates, letters of recommendation Margaret had written, news articles about former students achieving greatness, award ceremonies, scholarships, breakthroughs, 847 lives transformed by one woman who cared. Aisha stepped forward, standing beside Deshawn. She didn't just teach us to read, she said, her voice carrying through the silent room. She taught us we were worth saving. She looked at us when the whole world looked away. She invested in us when everyone else said we were bad investments. And now look at us, Burr. He gestured to the crowd behind her. Doctors who healed, lawyers who fought for justice, teachers who continued Margaret's legacy, parents who raised children with the same love Margaret had shown them, generations of success, all tracing back to one classroom, room 214. Marcus Thompson walked slowly to the table. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. Every step carried weight. Every movement demanded attention. When he reached the board, he paused and looked at each member in turn. I almost didn't go to college, he said quietly. I got accepted to Morehouse, but we couldn't afford the deposit. $500, that's all that stood between me and my future. And Mrs. Hayes paid it, out of her own pocket, without telling anyone, without asking for anything in return. She reached into his jacket and pulled out a check. He slid it across the table toward the superintendent. This is from her former students, he said, all of us. We pooled our resources, we made phone calls, we reached out to everyone Mrs. Hayes ever helped. The superintendent looked at the check. His eyes widened. The amount written on that small piece of paper was $1.2 million. That money, Marcus continued, is for Lincoln Heights Elementary, to rebuild it, to give those children the resources they deserve. The resources Mrs. Hayes spent 40 years providing on her own because nobody else would. The room fell completely silent. Not a whisper, not a shuffle, just profound, overwhelming silence. Margaret's knees buckled. She had stood strong for so long. Through the accusations, through the humiliation, through the loneliness of fighting alone. But this was too much. 40 years of giving, and it was all coming back to her in a single moment. Deshawn caught her before she fell. His strong arms wrapped around her, holding her steady. We've got you, Mrs. Hayes, he whispered. We've always got you. Other former students rushed forward. They surrounded Margaret like a protective shield. They hugged her. They wept with her. They told her they loved her. Parents who had watched Margaret save their children pushed through the crowd to grasp her hands. Grandmothers who remembered sending their babies to room 214 decades ago wiped tears from their weathered faces. The boardroom that had felt so cold, so hostile, was now filled with warmth and love. Burp, burp. The superintendent tried to speak. He opened his mouth several times, but no words came out. What could he possibly say? What defense could he offer? He had prepared to destroy a woman who had given everything for children who had nothing. And now he was surrounded by the living proof that Margaret Hayes was the greatest investment Lincoln Heights had ever made. The other board members sat frozen in their seats. Patricia Whitmore, who had called Margaret manipulative, was crying quietly into her hands. Another member stared at the floor, unable to face the crowd that filled the room. A third sat with his head bowed, shame written across every feature. They had come to this meeting believing they held all the power. They had come to silence a troublesome teacher who made them look bad. But they hadn't understood what Margaret Hayes truly was. She wasn't a liability. She wasn't a problem to be solved. She was the foundation upon which hundreds of success stories had been built. Deshawn Williams addressed the board directly. His voice was calm but commanding. You are about to vote on whether to fire Mrs. Hayes, he said. Whether to strip her of her pension, whether to end her career in disgrace. I want you to look around this room before you cast that vote. Look at what she created. Look at who we became because of her. The board members looked. They saw the doctors and the lawyers and the teachers. They saw the parents and grandparents holding photographs of children who had graduated from poverty because one woman refused to let them fail. They saw generations of success standing shoulder to shoulder, united by their love for Margaret Hayes. Harold Brennan cleared his throat. His face was flushed with embarrassment. "I think," he said slowly, "we may have been premature in our assessment, bar." Arcus Thompson stepped forward again. "Let me make something very clear," he said, his voice hard. "Mrs. Hayes doesn't need this job. She doesn't need your pension. With that check we just gave you, she could retire tomorrow and live comfortably for the rest of her life. But that's not what she wants. She wants to keep teaching. She wants to keep helping children who have no one else. And you are going to let her." It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact. The board understood that they had no choice. The community that had seemed invisible before was now very visible indeed. And they were watching. The vote was unanimous. 5 hands raised in favor of Margaret Hayes keeping her position. 5 voices agreeing that no further action would be taken. 5 faces that would never forget this humiliation. But more importantly, they would never forget this lesson. 3 months later, Lincoln Heights Elementary looked different. Construction crews had gutted the old building and rebuilt it from the ground up. New classrooms with proper heating, a library with thousands of books, computer labs and science equipment, a cafeteria that served hot meals to every child regardless of whether they could pay. And above the front entrance, in letters carved from stone, was a new name, the Margaret Hayes Academy of Excellence. The dedication ceremony drew hundreds of people. Former students flew in from across the country. Current students lined up in their best clothes. Community members who had watched the school crumble for decades stood in amazement at what it had become. Television cameras captured every moment. Reporters interviewed successful alumni who credited Margaret Hayes with changing their lives. When it came time for Margaret to speak, she walked slowly to the podium. She was 62 years old. She was tired. She had given everything she had and then found more to give. But standing before this crowd, looking out at the faces of children she had saved and adults she had raised, she had never felt more complete. She didn't give a long speech. She didn't need to. She looked at the crowd with eyes full of love and spoke one sentence. "I spent everything I had because you were worth more than I could ever keep." The crowd wept. Parents held their children close. Former students embraced each other. Even the reporters wiped their eyes. It was a moment of pure, overwhelming love. That night, after the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, a reporter approached Marcus Thompson. She asked him why he had organized the rescue of Margaret Hayes, why he had rallied hundreds of former students to descend on that board meeting, why he had gathered $1.2 million to rebuild a school he hadn't attended in decades. Marcus smiled. It was the same smile he had worn the day Margaret gave him the money for Morehouse, the smile of someone who understood something profound. "Mrs. Hayes taught me that wealth isn't what you have," he said. "It's what you leave behind." She never had $1 million, but she created millionaires. Not just in money, but in character, in purpose, in heart. The world will forget the rich, but it will always remember the generous. Margaret Hayes continued teaching for 5 more years before she retired. Every single day she walked through the doors of the school that bore her name, and every single day she changed lives. When she finally stepped away from the classroom, her former students threw her a party that lasted 3 days. They gave her a house free and clear. They set up a foundation in her name to help teachers across the country. They made sure she would never want for anything for the rest of her life. Because that's what love does. It comes back. It multiplies. It returns in ways you never expect. Some people count their money. Others count the lives they change. Margaret Hayes never had $1 million in her bank account, but she created millionaires of character, purpose, and heart. She taught generations of children that they were worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, worth believing in, and they proved her right in ways that no spreadsheet could ever measure. The world will forget the rich, but it will always remember the generous. Always.